I'm David Sellars. I'm a coach for Peaks Coaching Group here in Bedford, Virginia. My favorite place to be on a bike is right here in the Blue Ridge Mountains on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and actually where I did these tests was on the Thunder Ridge climb. And the good thing about this climb, it's a gradual slope around 6%. So for me personally, I can climb it fairly comfortably seated or standing. It's not steep enough to where you have to stand up and push through the climb. You can choose. You can stay seated or you can stand and climb it fairly easily at whatever power you want to, endurance, tempo, or at FTP. So the test was structured around two intervals. Number one was a seated and standing interval of 45 minutes long. Pretty much how I would normally do the climb, a mixture of standing for a couple minutes at a time and then staying seated. The second interval was totally seated for the entire 45 minutes and wanted to see what the difference between those two, both in power, distance, and perceived exertion, and then obviously all the good data from the Type R as far as the dead spot score, the pelvic tilt, and some of the other channels. Yeah, one of the good features of the Type R is being able to determine when you're standing on the bike. And during the first interval, where I was both seated and standing, and then looking at the data online, I was able to see exactly when I was standing based off my pelvic tilt angle, and I determined I stood for about 10% of that 45 minutes. That's where we noticed I do have a little bit more dead spot score compared to seated. We went about 8.7 miles within that 45-minute interval. The second interval, once again, I stayed seated for the entire 45 minutes. The dead spot score was pretty much 0, and that's fairly normal for me in a seated position. Distance-wise, I did go a little bit farther, closer to 8.9 miles. I think seated in general probably is a little more efficient, a little more economical, but if that comes at the cost of comfort and just considering the long run, whether it's a 30-minute interval, 40-minute, or a 2-hour ride, being able to stretch your back, stretch your legs, get a different position for, once again, in the long run, you feel better. I think you should definitely incorporate that. I guess between the two intervals, the unexpected piece was that the perceived exertion was harder for the seated interval. Once again, I think we usually think staying seated is going to be easier than having to stand up and pedal, but I think it goes back to the comfort level of staying seated for a certain amount of time versus being able to stand and stretch your back.